I'll be presenting a project, as was mentioned, that we started in 2017 at the University of Wyoming. You can see a number of people were on that project, and I learned a great deal through that experience, and I'm excited to share that with you today. First, a little background about the greater sage-grouse. This bird was originally petitioned to be listed on the endangered species list in 2002. Since that time, in 2015, it was believed due to collaborative efforts between federal agencies and private landowners that it was avoided for being listed on the endangered species list. And one of the key partnerships was a program called the Sage-Grouse Initiative, which was launched in 2010. From their website, it's a partner-based, science-driven effort that is part of the Working Lands for Wildlife program, which is led by the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. So part of this effort is working with ranchers to implement these specific prescribed grazing approaches, which is the topic today. In 2017, we set out to assess the profitability of select prescribed grazing programs, and this research had two important elements to it. One was developing enterprise budgets, and those are, looking at, specifically we looked at cow-calf ranchers and their income, their costs, and then also their portfolio of forage and feed resources. And then the second part of this study was taking that information from those enterprise budgets and putting them into what we call ranch models, and that enabled us to simulate these impacts from implementing prescribed grazing. So this is a map showing the areas of study. We worked with NRCS to identify the areas of interest, and they were those that were critical habitat for sage-grouse. The team had 4 members that did the very important work of researching and putting these enterprise budgets together. And I want to name them here. Tom Hilkin, who now works for the NRCS, Kendall Roberts, Holly Kirkpatrick, and Holly Dyer. They went out into the field in pairs and met with focus groups throughout the West. Their work was published in a series of enterprise budgets, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And I just also want to thank the extension agents that worked with the team. They were key in many areas for getting ranchers together to collect this representative ranch information. Typically, there are 4 representative ranch types that we consider for these types of studies. They have different profit margins and also different investment in equipment, so it can be important to capture these differences. So the small and large listed there is what you would think of as there's more head of brood cows than there are in the large ranches versus the small. So that's pretty straightforward. The public and private piece, public means that this representative ranch has a portion of their grazing portfolio that is on public land, and they also have a portion that is on private rangeland, but a portion on public as well. Whereas these ones that just say private, that means that they do not have a public rangeland grazing component. So this team of researchers, as I mentioned, went out to collect this information from focus groups. As I mentioned, consisted, primarily of representative cow-calf ranches in these areas. And the information that they collected included, what were their assets, what was their tax burden, the opportunity costs, and was also included in these budgets. And then season of resource use, which is an important one in terms of timing throughout the year of their forage and feed resources. Here's to show you an example. These are example dates, but up there in the top, we can see every one of these representative ranches had a time during the year when they were feeding hay, and it does vary depending on the geographic region that they're in, how long that feeding hay season is. Then they would go out onto another forage source, and so it depends upon which forage source, depending on which representative ranch and which area. But each of these ranches had a private rangeland component, and I bring that to your attention because that's NRCS financial support is specifically for the private rangelands component, and so that's the important part that we're looking at today. This work has been published as enterprise budgets through the Wyoming Extension Service, and I will provide the link for that at the end of this talk. But there's 36 budgets there. Here shows one for a small cow-calf ranch of 50 head, but they're all 36 there are online and available information for you to use that you might find interesting. So this is the part that I primarily worked on, was taking those representative ranch enterprise budgets and putting them into what we call representative ranch models. So these models incorporate income, costs, things like that, and they actually are kind of a planning tool. So they're considering income stream over 40 years and income and costs. And then because it's over 40 years, looking ahead, we use this term called net present value because that there is some discounting involved. The years out into the future are the money is worth less than the money today. So I have this in green here on this side showing practices going into these what we call baseline models. We start with the baseline model and then we implement the impact. And I put practices because we're looking at prescribed grazing practices today, but really these models can evaluate things like drought, prescribed grazing, or excuse me, prescribed fire, wildfire. So important to think about through your research where there might be areas of collaboration to use these models and evaluate impacts on ranchers. I wanted to also say that the neat thing about having these over 40 years is things like prescribed grazing. We can put in the costs and timing of installation. We can also consider the forage amount available in these baseline models, and then if forage increases due to these practices. So we talked about the different forage and feed sources used throughout the year, and a critical piece of these models of these ranching enterprises is that they balance forage supply with herd demand for each of the seasons throughout the year. And again, I just want to bring your attention that and I should say when they balance the forage that is available, the herd can be demand can be less than or equal to that amount, but it cannot go over that amount. So the forage amount really constrains the ranching enterprise here. And also I just want to bring to your attention that the private range portion is what we're specifically interested in this study because that's where with the NRCS practices we'll be implementing the prescribed grazing, modeling that. So going forward, we knew that we wanted to have answers about specific components. You know, what are the popular prescribed grazing practices? How much cost will be involved with these fencing and sage-grouse markers that come along with certain prescribed grazing practices, the water developments as well, and then what are these financial supports dollar amounts, these sage-grouse incentive payments from NRCS. So we talked with the NRCS about this and identified two common practices, usually moving from a single pasture to a 5-pasture system. And then the two practices were rotation. And then also the second one was rest rotation. With rest rotation, the idea is resting one of those pastures for 12 months or more. I just want to bring our attention here. I mentioned, you know, we have this baseline model and then we implement the impacts. And in this baseline model, we considered having one water source, that's the blue there. And then you can imagine cattle like to group kind of around that water source. So moving to this other system, we're looking at better cattle distribution throughout the range there, and forage availability increases as a result. A little bit more about the financial support from a component. We talked with them again and they told us about habitat management payments. Those would be available for the first 3 years, and implementing the rest rotation practice would result in greater habitat management payments than for rotation only. Then also EQIP, we assumed that they would be eligible for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, meaning they'd only have to pay about 25% of the costs of things like cross fencing, water development, and fence markers for sage-grouse. A little bit about the forage production element. So in that baseline model, we took information from ecological site descriptions to get at a typical forage production there. Then in implementing these prescribed grazing practices, we considered that they'd have improved water distance factor, which is just a fancy way of saying improved grazing distribution within those pastures. And then also that they would have the possibility that they might have improved harvest efficiency. So improved harvest efficiency, specifically means the percentage of total forage that is ingested by the animal. And so we're assuming a 25% harvest efficiency, but when implementing these practices, we might see an increase. So we did sort of a sensitivity analysis where we looked at results without an increase and with going to an increase, and that assumption was a 30% harvest efficiency. So what we found is that different representative ranches generally had different amounts of privately owned rangelands. These are just averages over all the geographic areas that you saw in that original map for each of the representative ranch types. And you can see their private rangeland component. For example, the small public ranch had a much smaller quantity of private rangeland hectares than, say, the large private representative ranch type. And you'll also see in the results that this does seem to make a difference in how well they do with the prescribed grazing practice financially. So it's important. This is just to show that there are variations. This is a box and whisker plot. The X represents the average, and then the whiskers show the range. So I showed averages in the previous slide. It does vary depending upon geographic region, but you can see in general, for example, the small public representative ranches had much smaller rangeland, private rangeland resources than the large private ranch, for example. So these results came together in 2-page summaries that are available, and you can get those from me if you are interested, and it just gives a lot more specifics about the actual results. But here's it's a short presentation, so I'm going to provide just averages across geographic region for each ranch type. And you can see at the top line there, we saw increases. This is percent change in herd size as a result of implementing the practice. And we saw increases in herd size because of increased forage availability. The HE actually represents harvest efficiency. So this one is the standard 25% harvest efficiency. This one's going to an increase in harvest efficiency. So you can see we see larger increases in herd size with greater harvest efficiency. That rotation there, that means implementing the rotation practice. What happened to the net present value of profit? Well, I'll just show you as an example. If the harvest efficiency stayed the same for this large private ranch, we saw a 10% increase in the net present value of their profit stream. So you can see all the way across here, we saw increases, and we saw larger increases with the rest rotation. And that's, as I mentioned, because the habitat management payments are greater from NRCS for that practice. So those were the large ranches. The small ranches didn't, and these are averages again, but didn't fare as well. So for that small private ranch, we actually see the net present value of profit for the rotation went down by 7%, meaning that they lost money. However, if we did see a harvest efficiency increase, they did see a positive gain in profit. So the small public ranch fared the worst, and we see in both practice cases a decrease in net present value of profit there. However, there's a harvest efficiency gain. They on average at least break even or see a gain. in conclusion, do we see a profit gain? Is this economical for sage-grouse conservation? And the answer is that it depends, but overall it looks to be favorable. The harvest, especially if we see a gain in harvest efficiency, and that kind of leads us to understand that it's one of the more important variables that we maybe wanted to look at in terms of outcomes from prescribed grazing as we're looking at the profitability side of things. I want to thank our funders for making this research possible, and also I provided my contact information as well as some links that you might find interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was great. I haven't received any questions in the chat box yet, but so I'm going to go ahead and ask a question.
Okay, great.
So is there like a government program that will compensate ranchers for doing the prescribed kind of grazing, the rest rotation schedule, rather than let's say just generic status quo grazing their pastures through? There's a program that will give them money for compensating for that stuff?
Yeah, so the Natural Resource Conservation Service is, they provide both financial support and technical support, so kind of advising. But so that is one of the things that we wanted to really look at is, you know, this money can be out there for ranchers that are interested in engaging, but ultimately, even with these incentive structures, you know, are they doing well ultimately? Or are they possibly losing money? And this is just the financial side. There's definitely other non-market benefits that we didn't incorporate, but and so through that sage-grouse initiative, what we learned from NRCS is that they have these extra habitat management payments. They're for the first 3 years of ranching, of implementing this practice, like you said, rest rotation or rotation, and that it's important also that it's in the first 3 years, because that's when they're going to see the costs, and the benefits that they might see might take some time. And so all of those things are important factors. And then there's also, even before that came around, there's the EQIP program, which provides, you know, shared costs for many different practices, not just these. And the idea is to support these infrastructure items and other things like that. So.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So Cassia wants to know, anyone checking on the grazing levels and advising the rancher of if the desired levels are being achieved for managing sage-grouse?
That's a good question. There are specific people around in different areas they're called, I'm blanking on the name right now. If Tom Hill comes on the line, he'll tell me. But I feel like it's ResCons, resource conservation. Anyway, there's specific people out there that people know that they can go to for help with these things. And when, it's a really good question for NRCS specifically, but it's my understanding that when they engage in these programs that isn't, to get the funding, there is an active person-to-person contact. But there's probably more people online that know a little bit more about that than I do.
Thanks, Anna. So another question from Haley. Interesting presentation. Sorry if you covered this. Can you repeat the definition of what harvest efficiency means? Also, how did you manipulate it? And was it through the grazing rotation? Okay,
that's a great question. So one of the things that I don't do a very good job of when I'm talking about the differences in harvest efficiency is that we weren't saying that we don't know if when the practice is implemented, if harvest efficiency will increase or not. So we didn't manipulate it. We just thought, if harvest efficiency does increase, does that make a difference in whether there's a net benefit to the rancher or not? So we just went from a 25% harvest efficiency to 30%. That was kind of informed by the literature, but it's not a clear-cut thing, just to see if it would make a difference. And we did see that it did make a difference. For example, that large public ranch, or that small public ranch on average, saw a profit loss unless it had that harvest efficiency gain. I hope that answers the question.
So we've got another question from Lavana. Is there evidence that the modified grazing prescriptions continue or intending to continue beyond the 3 years of the NRSC support?
That's a good question. That's another one of the ideas about, what are the details of the contract between NRCS and the rancher. And I don't have that specific information, but we did assume that they would continue. The infrastructure is already in place, that most of the investment cost is already in place. So we assumed that they would continue with that rotation system after it was already implemented. The other thing that we considered was, after we considered the longevity of these items like fence. So after like 20 years, they're going to have to be replaced or fixed. And so we incorporated operation and maintenance costs in there as well. So I think one of the ideas would be that if a rancher knows going in, they're going to see a profit or some other benefit, over the lifetime, they're going to continue to do what they're doing, and they may even implement those and keep up with the operation maintenance and such like that. But these are net values even after operation and maintenance and having to redo those fences after, and other structures after 20 years. And we did assume when we had to redo those that EQIP would again throw in money so that they only had to pay about 25% of costs, but we didn't redo those habitat management payments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question from Jane. Has there been an extrapolation of the net cash benefits of ongoing practice without the NRSC financial supplementation? So that kind of ties right into what you just answered.
Well, no, thank you. I appreciate that, because that's exactly the question that we've been being asked over the last year or so. And so actually I was recently funded about 6 months ago to start working on that. So I'm about 3/4 of the way of modeling without the NRCS financial support. And that's in the preliminary stages right now. But it doesn't look like they're coming out ahead without that support. But I'm hesitant to say that for sure. But yeah, that's where we're going with that. And that's going to be the next sort of part 2 phase of this project. So thanks for asking that important question.
So, I'll do a last call for questions for anybody. Feel free to unmute your mic. You can ask your questions there if you don't want to type them in the chat box. But I'll hold Anna here for another minute or so. So just for the audience, everyone, in your invite, I had a link for our YouTube channel, and so you know that this will be available to everyone on the YouTube channel, and also under the meetings tab on our website, pnwsrm.org. And we've got a follow-up from Jane now too. There we go. So if there appears to be no apparent cash flow benefit after study, what would be the incentive for continuation?
Oh, so the thing that I'm looking at is not necessarily whether they would, once they get the cash flow benefit, if they would, and then it stops. The thing that I would be looking at in the part 2 would be if they never had the incentive payment from the government in the first place. I think the question is, why would they continue? Since we saw it was overall favorable, profitable in most cases, of course, you're going to continue with that. Also, the infrastructure is already set up there. So there's quite a bit of investment cost and money that went out from the rancher. That's just kind of hypothesizing, but that's the idea there, is that you would keep up with it because you've already invested. So. But good question.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, there's one more question there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so this will be our last question for this presentation. Jacob asks, with the NRCS assistance, has there been a high level of rancher participation in prescribed grazing? Or is it more time education needed for increased participation?
Okay, yeah, so what I looked at on the sage-grouse initiative website is through that initiative, they've worked with about nearly 1,900 ranchers so far. And I think it was 7 million acres conservation work across the 11 Western states. I'm sure more education and increased participation is needed because they funded us for studies like these. And I think they're trying to get more information out there about how possible benefits for everyone involved. And yeah, and education and increased participation, and I believe is one of their goals. So yeah, like I said, it's great that we're all studying these important topics in surrounding rangelands, and I appreciate you all your interest in continuing this research. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anna. I think this presentation really kind of increases confidence in if you want some uptake, if you just have a funding program just for future, and how we can apply it in our province as well, and how you've done so down in the States. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for attending our final webinar in the Fall 2020 series here at Home on the Range. Yeah, it was really nice being able to have, especially with all the COVID stuff, having to have everybody having to be separate, but also being able to come together online and still being able to interact with each other. So again, this Anna's presentation will be available on our YouTube channel as well for anyone who couldn't make it, or if you just want to watch it again and get some more details out of it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. I'll let you go now, Anna, and thank you, everybody. And we'll be in touch in future with future events, and our meeting, our AGM is coming up as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Anna.